Mercedes may have just won the first 3 races of the season, but behind the scenes, they may have just lost the room. Because Formula One just did something it almost never does this early, this openly and this unanimously. It changed its own rules in the middle of a season. And that alone tells you how uncomfortable this 2026 package has already become. The drivers were angry, the fans were unconvinced, the racing looked strange. And when the pressure finally peaked, every team signed off on changes that Mercedes clearly did not want to go this far. So this is not just a story about new rule tweaks. This is the story of the moment Toto Wolff stopped controlling the direction of the conversation and started reacting to it. That is what makes this so important. Because when you strip away all the technical language, all the energy maps, all the recharge numbers and deployment zones, the message is simple. Formula One looked at its new era, saw a problem, and decided it could not wait. And that is a big moment. At first, this sounds like a routine technical update. A few refinements here, a small correction there, maybe a little tuning before Miami. But the truth is much more serious than that. The rules were barely alive before they needed surgery. That is how quickly the panic set in. Qualifying needed help. Race behavior needed help. Starts needed help. Wet running needed help. That is not what a healthy rule set looks like. And the biggest reason this matters is because the agreement was unanimous. That means the teams who were benefiting still signed it. The teams who were suffering obviously signed it. And the teams that normally block each other politically all ended up in the same room and decided the situation had gone far enough. That is not normal. That is Formula One admitting that if it did not move now, the criticism was only going to get louder. And at the center of all of this was Toto Wolff. Because before the changes were confirmed, he was trying very clearly to shape the tone of the debate, not deny that issues existed, not completely reject changes, but keep them small, keep them careful, keep them controlled. And he said it in the line that became the headline of the entire day: "We should treat things with a scalpel, not a baseball bat." That line matters because it tells you exactly what Mercedes wanted, not a reset, not a major correction, not a broad political defeat disguised as technical reform. Just enough change to calm people down without changing the competitive order too much. And from Mercedes' point of view, that makes perfect sense. Why would you want the sport to swing hard when you are already winning? Why would you want to reopen a rulebook when your package is already at the front? Why would you want your rivals handed a second chance before the season is even fully settled? That is why the scalpel line was never really about caution alone. It was about protection. Protection of advantage. Protection of momentum. Protection of a regulation direction Mercedes had every reason to feel confident in. But then the vote happened. And what came out of it was not exactly a baseball bat. But it definitely was not a scalpel either, because the changes went further than the gentle touch Mercedes had been arguing for. Qualifying recharge was cut. Superclipping behavior was adjusted. Race deployment was capped more aggressively in certain areas. Start procedures were altered with automatic support systems. Wet condition behavior got adjusted too. That is not cosmetic. That is Formula One stepping in and saying, "We have seen enough to act." And once that happened, the bigger political question became obvious. If Mercedes could not hold the line here, what else might they fail to control later in the year? Because this is where the story gets even more interesting. The regulation tweak battle matters, but the engine catch-up battle may matter even more. And Toto knows it. That is why, while these rule changes were going through, he was already shifting the argument toward the next fight, the ADU mechanism, the system designed to help manufacturers recover if they are falling behind. And again, he gave us the exact line that reveals what Mercedes are really worried about. The problem is simply that you can tweak these regulations a bit, but fundamentally something is wrong. Now that line came from Max Verstappen in the source, not Toto, and that is what makes it so powerful. Because Verstappen's line tells you the opposite side of the story. Mercedes wanted smaller changes because the fundamentals still served them. Max's side of the argument is that the fundamentals themselves are broken. And if enough people inside the sport now agree with that direction, then this Miami package may only be the beginning. That is the real pressure point. Because once Formula One proves it is willing to intervene, the next fight becomes much easier to imagine. More changes later. More pressure from drivers. More complaints from teams stuck behind. and more arguments over how much help manufacturers should be allowed if their engine package is underperforming. That is where Toto starts looking nervous. Not because Mercedes are suddenly finished. They are not. They are still strong. They are still winning. They are still one of the smartest operators in the paddock. But political power in Formula One is not just about who has the fastest car. It is about who can shape the outcome when the room turns tense. And on this occasion, Mercedes did not get the room they wanted. That is why this moment feels bigger than the numbers on paper. Yes, this is about kilowatts and megajoules and deployment maps, but underneath all that, this is really about momentum. The drivers created momentum. The backlash created momentum. And once enough voices lined up behind the idea that the current product was not acceptable, Mercedes could no longer frame the response entirely on their own terms. That is what they lost. Not the season, not the championship, not the front row. They lost control of the mood, and in Formula One, that can be the first thing to go before much bigger things start moving. Because now every team knows the rules are not untouchable. Every driver knows pressure can work. Every rival knows Mercedes can be pushed. And every future political fight will happen under that shadow. That is why Miami matters so much, not just because the rules are changing. Because Miami is now the first test of whether Formula One has only softened the symptoms or started a much deeper correction. If the racing looks better, the FIA will say the intervention worked. If the problems still feel obvious, then people will immediately ask for more. And if that happens, Toto Wolff will not be fighting to preserve a perfect system. He will be fighting to stop the whole thing from shifting further away from Mercedes' comfort zone. And that is the real takeaway here. Mercedes may still have the best car. Mercedes may still have the strongest operation. Mercedes may still be the team everyone has to beat. But for the first time in this 2026 story, they are not the team setting the emotional direction of the paddock. The drivers did that. The backlash did that. And Formula One responded. So yes, Mercedes are still at the front. But politically, this may be the week they realize the rest of the sport is no longer prepared to simply sit back and let them define where this era goes next.